November 5, 1991. Somewhere off the coast of the Canary Islands, a luxury yacht called the Lady Ghislaine is cutting through dark water. Its owner is not on deck. Not in his cabin. Not anywhere. By morning, a Spanish Air Force helicopter finds his body floating in the Atlantic, roughly 20 miles from where the yacht last had contact with him. No note. No warning. Just a man, one of the most powerful media titans on Earth, gone. You already know his name. Robert Maxwell. Newspaper king. Confidant of prime ministers. A man who once shook hands with world leaders and shaped what an entire nation read at breakfast. But here's what you don't know yet. In the hours before his death, Maxwell wasn't just drowning in the ocean. He was drowning in debt. Billions of it. And to stay afloat, records show, he had done something almost unthinkable. He had reached into the pension funds of his own employees. Cooks, printers, journalists, people who trusted him with their future. This is not a story about a media empire. This is not a story about a mysterious death at sea. This is a story about what happens when one man decides he is above the ledger, and what it costs everyone else when the ledger finally comes due. To understand how Robert Maxwell ended up in that water, you have to go back nearly 70 years, to a small Jewish village in Czechoslovakia, where a boy named Jan Ludwig Hoke was born into poverty so severe that shoes were considered a luxury. By the time he was a teenager, the world he knew was gone. The Holocaust took his parents. It took his sisters. It took almost everyone he loved. He escaped alone, joined the Czech resistance as little more than a boy, and eventually made his way into the British Army, where he fought with a kind of ferocity that earned him the Military Cross, one of Britain's highest honors for bravery. Somewhere in that transformation, he changed his name. He built a new identity. Piece by piece. The way a man builds a fortress out of whatever materials survive a fire. By the end of the war, Jan Hoke no longer existed. Robert Maxwell did, a decorated war hero. Fluent in 9 languages. With nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. You have to sit with that contradiction for a moment. Because everything that follows only makes sense once you understand it. This was a man who had watched fascism strip away everything he had, his family, his home, his name, and who spent the rest of his life accumulating power as if enough of it could make him untouchable again. Follow the money. Because that fortress he built? It wasn't made of stone. It was made of debt, leverage, and borrowed time, and every brick of it would eventually come due. By the 1980s, Robert Maxwell wasn't just a publisher. He was an institution. He'd already spent decades building Pergamon Press into a scientific publishing powerhouse. But in 1984, he made the move that would define his public legacy. He acquired the Mirror Group, one of Britain's largest newspaper publishers, home to millions of daily readers and a printing operation that ran through the night. Every night. Picture the scale of it. Corporate jets on standby. A private helicopter parked outside his estate at Headington Hill Hall. A security detail that moved with him like a shadow. Dinners with heads of state. He counted prime ministers, foreign leaders, and intelligence officials among his personal acquaintances. He didn't just report the news anymore. In some rooms, he was the news. But here's the question that should nag at you. How does one man convince banks to hand him billions of pounds in loans? Again and again. For decades? The answer is simple. And it's the same answer behind almost every empire built on sand. Confidence. Maxwell was, by every account, a master of psychological theater, a booming voice that filled a room before he even entered it. An immovable physical presence. The kind of man who made bankers feel foolish for doubting him out loud. And it worked. Through the mid to late 1980s. He kept buying. American printing companies, European publishers, television and satellite ventures. Each acquisition financed by more debt, stacked on top of the debt before it. Like a tower built by a man who genuinely believed gravity didn't apply to him. Hold that thought. Because as early as 1971, more than a decade before he even bought the mirror, there were people who saw through the theater completely. And they wrote it down. In 1971, British government inspectors from the Department of Trade and Industry launched a formal investigation into one of Maxwell's earlier ventures, Pergamon Press, following disputed dealings with an American company. Their conclusion was devastating. According to their report, Maxwell was, in their own words, not the kind of man who could be trusted to run a publicly listed company. Think about what that means. This wasn't a rival newspaper making an accusation. This wasn't gossip in a boardroom. This was the British government, on the record, telling the public that this man could not be trusted with other people's money. You would think a verdict like that would end a career. It didn't. Maxwell fought back with everything he had: lawsuits, public relations campaigns, sheer relentless force of personality, and slowly rebuilt his reputation. Within a decade, banks were lining up to lend him money again. Within 13 years, he owned one of the most powerful newspaper groups in the country. This is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Warning after warning, regulator after regulator, and every single time, the system let him back in. Not because the evidence wasn't there, the 1971 report sat in public record for anyone to read, but because power has a way of insulating itself from consequence. Right up until the moment it absolutely cannot anymore. This is not a story about one dishonest man slipping quietly through the cracks. This is not a story about a single bad decision made under pressure. This is a story about an entire system that kept extending credit, financial and moral, to a known risk, until he used every ounce of it to gamble with thousands of pensioners' futures. By the late 1980s, Maxwell's empire was drowning in debt from an aggressive, almost frantic buying spree. The most damaging purchase of all was an American publishing company called Macmillan. Bought in 1988 for roughly $2.6 billion, a price widely seen as wildly inflated. Driven largely by his determination to beat his fiercest rival, Rupert Murdoch, to the deal. So he needed cash, fast. And according to later investigations by British regulators, he found it in the one place that should have been completely untouchable: the occupational pension funds of Mirror Group newspapers, the retirement savings of the very people who printed his papers every night. Here's how it worked. Stripped of the jargon, Maxwell controlled a web of private, family-owned holding companies on one side, and public companies, including the pension funds, on the other. Through a practice investigators later described as cross-collateralization, assets from the pension funds, hundreds of millions of pounds in shares and cash, were quietly transferred through private holding companies. Some registered in offshore jurisdictions like Liechtenstein, to prop up his crumbling private empire. Picture it as a chain. Pension trustees held shares meant for retired printers and journalists. Those shares were lent out, or pledged as collateral, to banks. The cash raised against that collateral flowed not back to the pension fund, but into Maxwell's private companies, which used it to buy back and support the price of Maxwell's own stock, creating the illusion that his empire was still solvent, still growing, still worth the debt piled on top of it. In simple terms, he used other people's retirement money as collateral to keep his own sinking ship afloat, while making sure the outside world never saw the water rising below deck. The final figure investigators would later put on the missing funds was staggering, somewhere between 400 and 460 million pounds. Money that belonged to printers, secretaries, journalists nearing retirement, who had spent decades trusting that their pension statements meant something real. By the autumn of 1991, the pressure had become unbearable. Banks were calling in loans that Maxwell could no longer roll over. Journalists, including reporters at rival papers who smelled blood, were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about where exactly the money had gone, and why his company's balance sheets no longer seemed to add up. Maxwell was juggling an empire that existed more on paper than in reality. And the paper was starting to tear at every seam. He was reportedly making increasingly desperate calls to bankers late into the night, personally trying to arrange emergency financing to plug holes that had grown too large to hide. You can imagine what those final weeks must have felt like for a man who had spent an entire lifetime projecting invincibility. Every phone call a potential threat. Every headline a potential exposure. There was no press release powerful enough to fix what was coming. And, for perhaps the first time since he escaped Czechoslovakia as a teenager, there may have been nowhere left to run. Here's a bridge worth pausing on. This isn't just a story from 1991. The same psychological pattern, borrow against tomorrow to manufacture the appearance of strength today, is one that modern analysts still study in corporate collapses, and some argue, in the algorithm-driven confidence games that define entire sectors of today's markets. The tools have changed. The playbook of denial has not. And then came November 5th, the night the Lady Ghislaine sailed into the history books. For the wrong reason entirely. According to the official Spanish inquest, Robert Maxwell died of a heart attack, likely after falling overboard while relieving himself off the side of the yacht sometime in the early hours of the morning. That is the official record. That is what the coroner's report concluded. But the world, almost immediately, refused to accept it at face value. Some pointed to his mounting debts and the imminent exposure of the pension fund scheme, and speculated he may have taken his own life rather than face the public unraveling of everything he'd built. Others noted his extensive, well-documented intelligence connections across multiple governments over the decades, and speculated about far darker possibilities entirely. To this day, no version of events has been definitively proven beyond what the official inquest concluded. What is certain is the timing. Within days of his body being pulled from the Atlantic, banks began scrutinizing his company's accounts with a level of urgency that hadn't existed while he was alive to intimidate them. The missing pension money came to light almost immediately, as though the entire structure had only ever been held together by his presence in the room. Whether Maxwell jumped, fell, or something else happened entirely, his death didn't end the scandal. It's what finally exposed it. In the aftermath, Mirror Group newspapers collapsed into administration. Tens of thousands of pension holders faced the terrifying possibility of losing their retirement savings entirely, savings that, for many, represented 40 years of work at the printing presses and copy desks that had made Maxwell rich. His sons, Kevin and Ian Maxwell, were put on trial for fraud in connection with the pension funds. Both were ultimately acquitted after a lengthy trial, the jury concluding the case against them hadn't been proven beyond reasonable doubt, though the reputational damage to the family name proved permanent and inescapable. In the years that followed, regulatory reforms swept through British pension law, including the 1995 Pensions Act, designed specifically to prevent company directors from ever again treating employee retirement funds as their own private reserve. So what do you take from all of this? First, the facts. A media empire built on confidence and debt collapsed the moment the debt came due. And hundreds of millions of pounds meant for ordinary workers' retirements vanished in the process. Second, the system. Regulators had flagged this man as untrustworthy 2 full decades before the theft even occurred. And the system let him operate anyway, because power is remarkably good at buying itself more time. Right up until the debt collector finally arrives. Third, human nature. Robert Maxwell spent his entire life terrified of ever being powerless again. And in trying to outrun that fear, he became the very thing he once escaped as a boy. A man who took everything from people who had trusted him with their future. So tell us, do you think Robert Maxwell's death was a tragic accident? A desperate escape? Or something else entirely? Leave your theory in the comments below. And if this investigation into one of the greatest financial crimes of the 20th century kept you watching until the end, subscribe, because at Corrupt Ledger, every ledger hides a truth.